Hey everybody, welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games. Today we have another top 10 list for you all. Today I'm going to be sharing with you guys my top 10 board games designed by Michael Kiesling. Now, Michael Kiesling is one of the more prolific board game designers in the industry today. He is an award-winning designer, having won the coveted Spiel des Jahres many times over the course of his illustrious career. Now, these games here happen to be designs of his. Some of them are co-designs, but all of them can be attributed to him one way or another. So without any further ado, let's get straight to the list with my number 10 Michael Kiesling game. And actually, I am cheating once again. I have no number 10 for Michael Kiesling. I happen to have only played 9 of his designs, but I figured that a top 9 list did not sound quite as appealing. So let's get straight to my number 9 Michael Kiesling game, and that is Cusco. And this here is a remake of the original Java from the Mask trilogy of games. This is the sandwich game, the game in the middle of the 3 games. And this reprint here is by Super Meeple, and it's a gorgeous production. The colorful tiles in this game and the 3-dimensional temples that you will be placing. Such a neat element from a visual perspective, from a table presence perspective. Now, this game here, as I mentioned, is from the Mask trilogy, and I have played all 3 games in the Mask trilogy, and this happens to be my least favorite. I feel that it's the one that plays the least well with a 2-player count. All of these games in the Mask trilogy play from 2 to 4 players. This one plays a little bit better at 3 and 4 than at 2. I also find that it's a little bit longer than some of the other games, but it's still a brilliant design, and as I mentioned, very aesthetically pleasing. In this game, you have your action point allowance system, which was originated and coined by the co-designers in this game, Wolfgang Kramer and Michael Kiesling. And basically, you can take a certain amount of actions. There's a certain pool of actions you can choose from, and each of them have a certain amount of action points that they cost in order to trigger them. At the beginning of each round in this game, you have 6 action points to budget and choose from all the different action points or the different actions. You can choose to repeat them as long as you can pay for them. And this game here, just like all of the Mask trilogy games, there's an element of area majority. But in this game, the cool thing about this is that they've taken the area majority and added a 3-dimensional element to it. Because as you are placing down these tiles, which is very typical of these Mask trilogy of games, you can also place tiles on top of previously placed tiles in order to create an elevation. And basically, you're going to create higher and higher elevations, and your little meeples, your little workers here, can move through and climb on top of these elevations. And basically, you're creating enclosed areas that form cities, and in these cities, you're going to build your temples. And your temples are going to have certain heights to them, which will determine how valuable they are for you when scoring rounds are triggered. However, they're only going to score points for the players who have the majority in that area. And how do you determine the majority? Unlike typical area majority games where you simply count who has the most meeples in that area, instead you're going to count who has the most meeples in the highest elevation within that given area. It might be that multiple people are in equal standing as far as elevation is concerned, and then you'll simply go to a simple majority. But in many cases, you might have a case where theoretically, one player has more meeples in one location than you do. However, you might be higher than they are, and because of that, you are the chieftain. You are the tribal chief for that enclosed area, and you're going to score those victory points. I find that to be a very neat element. My number 9 Michael Kiesling game, Cusco. And now we move on to my number 8. And my number 8 Michael Kiesling game is a game that I happen to not own, and it's named Sansuchi. And Sansuchi is a solo design by Michael Kiesling, and it's basically a tile laying game where the board consists of multiple paths, and players are trying to lay down tiles and create paths from one end all the way to the other end of the board. And the tiles consist of different types of terrain features that represent palace, garden features. And players are basically choosing from 2 cards at a time in their hand in order to trigger which particular tiles they can draw from and place on the board. After they place a tile, they have the option to move one of their workers along that path. And they have 1 worker for each of the 7 different paths, I believe it is. And you are trying to advance as far through those paths as possible without getting stuck, because you might put yourself in a position where you are stuck, as one of your workers will no longer be able to move forward, and therefore you won't be able to score as many points, because one of the ways you score is by advancing those workers along those paths as far as possible. Another thing you want to consider is if you can complete the different rows and columns in this grid that make up your player board, because if you do, you'll be rewarded with additional points. It's a cool little puzzly tile laying game that I have enjoyed, although I've never pulled the trigger on purchasing it. My number 8 Michael Kiesling game, Sansuchi. Now we move on to my number 7 Michael Kiesling game, and it's another Mass Trilogy game, and this time we have Mexica. And again, this Mass Trilogy is a project, a co-design work of love with Michael Kiesling and Wolfgang Kramer. And again, this Central American theme. This is another remake from Super Meeple, well, in tandem with Yellow Games. And in this game here, this is the simplest of the 3 Mass Trilogy games. Players are basically creating areas. You have a map, a predetermined map with all the terrains already laid out for you, unlike the other 2 Mass Trilogy games. And what players are doing is they're building canals. They're digging up canals, and that's represented through the laying of tiles of different sizes that represent your canals. And basically, you're trying to enclose particular areas with these canals to form areas of particular sizes, because throughout the course of the game, you're trying to score. You have these circular discs here with different numbers representing the size of a terrain that a player has to create in order to found a particular territory. So you have anything from 3 to 4 to 5, all the way up to 9, 10, 11, 12, and you're trying to carve out these spaces. And once you have carved out an area of that particular size, then you can grab the token of that corresponding number, let's say 5, and place it in that territory you just carved out to indicate that you are its founders. Right then and there, you will score a particular bonus for founding that territory. Now, going forward, you're also going to score points for having the spiritual majority in said terrain. So this game, just like the others, is an area majority game, except the majority is not depicted by meeples. You actually only have 1 meeple in this game, your Pili Mexica, who's going to be moving throughout the course of the game in order to found different territories. But other than that, you're also going to be building temples, and you have temples of different sizes. Your temples, 3-dimensionally depicted in this edition here. Your temples can be of 1, 2, 3, or 4 levels. And basically, at the end of the first half of the game is divided into 2 halves, you're going to score points for having the majorities, the spiritual majorities, in each of these carved out areas. And basically, your spiritual majority is determined by the combined size of all of your temples in a given territory compared to anybody else who happens to be there. If your combined size of your temples has the majority, then you're going to score points for the majority. If you're playing with 2 or 3 or 4 players, then you'll also get consolation prizes for secondary spiritual majority as well. Really cool. Divided into 2 halves. You want to budget your temples wisely because you only have so much per half that you can use. Again, it is a lot simpler than Cusco, and that's why it's a little bit higher for me, number 7, but it's still not my favorite Mass Trilogy game, but my number 7 overall from Michael Kiesling, Mexica. And now we move on to my number 6, and my number 6 Michael Kiesling game is Adventureland. And Adventureland here is another co-design with Wolfgang Kramer. That's a name you're going to hear a lot on this list. These guys have collaborated for over a dozen titles over the course of their careers, and they work very well together. Now, this here is produced by Haba, which is a children's company, and this game is on the lighter end of their games. The back of the box says 10 to 99 years old. Don't play it if you're 100. And the board basically consists of a grid of multiple squares, and you have a row of letters on the top here, all the way from A through K, and here you have a column of numbers all the way from 1 through 10, and these basically represent the different coordinates on this grid. And players are going to be drawing cards from this deck here that are going to determine where they get to place their meeples. And their meeples represent their adventurers who are going questing. And basically, they can place their meeples down on a city in order to recruit additional adventurers going forward to help them defeat monsters and add to their strength. They can place their meeples in forest spaces where they can get medicines or herbs that will help them heal, or actually in this case contribute to their strength. Or they can go to mountainous areas where they will collect swords. Swords that have been forged in the mountains, and these swords will also be able to add to their pool that they can use in order to add to their strength. And why do they need these adventurers, these swords, and these medicinal herbs? Why do they need to contribute to their strength? Because they're going to be going to these other wilderness areas, and they're going to be fighting different monsters and bad guys, and that ultimately will be a big chunk of your victory points. And in order to defeat these bad guys, you're going to be able to have to summon enough strength. Now, the interesting thing about this game is you're going to be moving your meeples. You have your certain adventurers here on a column and rows. You're going to be moving them up and down and across these spaces, but you can only move them downward and rightward. You're never going to be able to move them upward or towards the left. So that's something to consider as you move your meeples. It's irreversible, and once you get to the lower right-hand corner here of the board, you're pretty much stuck with those workers. They're not going to be able to do anything else for you. So managing this all and timing when you're going to use your different workers is the heart of the game. Very simplistic from a rules perspective, but from a strategy perspective, it does grant the players lots of options. My number 6 Wolfgang, or actually I should say Michael Kiesling game, Adventureland. And now we move on to the top 5, the cream of the crop, my 5 absolute favorite Michael Kiesling games, starting with my number 5, which is Azul, the former Spiel des Jahres winner. And this here is Michael Kiesling's first go at a straight-up abstract game. Michael Kiesling designs can be pretty abstracted. However, they do have some theming to it, but this game is a straight up abstract, and as you can tell by the box cover art here, it's a beautiful game. Not only the box cover art, but the components inside are gorgeous. So first of all, we have these player boards, and the goal of this game, you have this grid right here, is to occupy as much of these spaces as possible. And on a player's turn, they're drafting these different tiles here from these discs, and you're always going to have a certain amount of discs according to the player count, and these tiles each have different colors and patterns on them, and they correspond with the different spots here on your grid that players are trying to occupy. And whenever you draft tiles from one of these discs, you got to grab all of the tiles of a particular color. So if you want one of these, for example, and there's 2 others on that tile, on that disc, then you're going to have to grab all of them, and you're going to have to find a place to put them here on the left side of your board. And you have different slots here for 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 of these potential tiles that you'll be drafting. And if you do not have space on these places for the tiles you just drafted, then the surplus will go to your floor on your board here. And at the end of the round, they're actually going to subtract points from your total. So that's something to keep in mind. But over here, you're going to wait till you fill up one of these rows. And once you fill up these rows, you're going to slide only one of those tiles over to its corresponding spot here on the grid, and you're going to score for it at least 1 point and potentially more for each connecting tile that you're able to make. So if you're able to trace back consecutive tiles to one another, that will score you additional points. And at the end of the game, you're going to score bonus points for completing different rows and different columns. And you're also going to score additional points if you're able to get all of the tiles of one particular pattern. Lots of really cool and neat ways of scoring in this game. And from a rules perspective, it's very streamlined. My number 5 Michael Kiesling game, Azul. And now we move on to my number 4. And my number 4 is the last, actually is the original, of the Mask Trilogy games, and that is Tikal, another co-design with Wolfgang Kramer and Michael Kiesling. In this case, I have the original Rio Grande production. I do not have the Super Meeple production with the nice 3-dimensional pieces, but I find that for an older Rio Grande game, this game here is very pretty looking. This game is also a former Spiel des Jahres winner from 1999. And basically, players represent different explorers on expeditions here in the jungles of Tikal. And throughout the course of the game, they're revealing these tiles, which basically simulate the excavating the jungles, basically cutting down the trees and creating land space that they can move through. And as they go through these tiles, they're going to find tiles that have nothing of value on them. They're going to find other tiles that have treasures on them, which basically will serve as a set collection. If you can have multiples of different of particular types of treasure, then during scoring rounds you're going to be able to score additional points. And also you have some temples, and each of the temples already start at a certain level. These temples can start at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 levels, and the higher the levels, that represent the more that temple has been excavated, the more that has been dug up, and the higher levels are going to score more points for you come scoring rounds. So you want to have the majority. This is an area majority game. The majority, as far as your explorers are concerned, you want to have the majority in a particular tile that has different, that has these temples, because only the person who has the majority will be able to score for those come a scoring round. Now, the interesting thing here is that when it comes to scoring rounds, when a scoring round is triggered, each player is going to, in turn order, be able to take their actions for that current round and then score, which means multiple people can theoretically end up scoring on the same scoring round for the same place, because every subsequent player will also be able to take their actions, and that might change who has the majority right then and right there. Really cool game. Action point allowance, as I mentioned earlier, where you have a bunch of different actions to choose from, and they all have a different amount of action points that they cause. So you're trying to budget this on each turn in order to get the most bang for your buck and be as efficient as possible. My number 4 Michael Kiesling game, Tikal. Now we move on to my number 3, and my number 3 Michael Kiesling game is Riverboat. And this game here is another solo design by Michael Kiesling. He does knock it out of the park on his solo designs, as well as his collaborations with Wolfgang Kramer. And this game here basically takes place in the upper Midwest, early 19th century, and players are basically simulating life along the Mississippi River, and they are placing different action cards or different terrain cards that are going to allow them to occupy different spots on their player board. And when they occupy these spots, they're going to be able to plant crops there, and then eventually they're going to be able to harvest these crops and ship them for additional victory points. Now, the cool thing about this game is that there are 5 different phases in each round, and this game takes place over the course of 4 rounds. And basically, at the beginning of each round, players are going to be able to draft from these different advantages, these different bonus tiles that are going to grant them an additional bonus for one of those particular 5 phases. So in this game plays up to 4 players. There's 5 phases. At least one player is going to have the advantage in 2 of those 5 phases. And you got to pick during that round which of those phases you most want to have an advantage in. And it's a really cool game. There's so many different ways of scoring points, from drafting different river boats, from advancing your harbor worker along the harbor track. That's going to allow you to score points for everything that's to the left of that harbor worker. Lots of cool little things. Every time you harvest crops, that's going to score points for you as well. My number 3 Michael Kiesling game, Riverboat. And now we move on to my number 2 Michael Kiesling game. And theoretically, this is a game I already mentioned, but not quite. And that is Azul Stained Glass of Sintra. Now, I must warn, I have not played Queen's Garden or Summer Pavilion. I've only played Azul Vanilla and Azul Stained Glass of Sintra. This is the sequel, the second out of the 4 Azul designs. And this is my favorite between this and Vanilla. It is a much more ruthless, less forgiving experience. Lots of ways of losing points. Lots of things that you have to keep track of. In particular, I like the aspect of a kind of like a modular experience, because your board, your player board, consists of this base here along with these different strips, and you have all these different strips here, and these represent the different columns that you're trying to fill with the tiles. And it has the same mechanism of drafting tiles from these discs. You draft all the tiles of a particular color, and then you place them, and you're trying to complete them. Now, not all columns are created equal. Some columns are going to score for you more points than others. And once you score a column, you will flip over this little strip, And now you have a different configuration of tiles you're trying to accomplish. And then you can eventually score for this one too. But you'll only be able to score for each strip twice. Once you've scored each strip, you are done. But you're also trying to place down tiles here representing your completion of these strips. And if you make combinations that are adjacent to one another here, then you'll be able to score additional points. So even the strategy of which strips you're going for in order to create this pattern of different tiles that connect to one another in order to score additional points, even that matters in this game. I also find this game, the color patterns, to actually be even more aesthetically pleasing than the original Azul, which is why I prefer it out of the two. My number 2 Michael Kiesling game, Azul. And now we move on to my number 1 Michael Kiesling game, my favorite game by this designer, and that is Coal Baron. And this is another co-design with Wolfgang Kramer, and this game is a pretty ugly looking game. The box cover art does not look very cool. The theme is not necessarily the most interesting. This is Essen on the verge of the 20th century, and you're the owner of a coal mine company, and you're fulfilling contracts. So thematically speaking, doesn't sound that interesting. However, from a gameplay perspective, it has lots of things that appeal to me. This is a worker placement game with a little bit of contract fulfillment, which I appreciate. And the cool thing about this game is that it's divided into 3 rounds. And progressively, the rounds become more interesting. Because on the first round, you're only going to score points for having the majority. Something about these designers, they like playing in majorities. If you have the majority in particular areas at the end of the first round, these first 4 areas, you're going to score points for that. Also, depending on the player count, you'll score points for having secondary. But after the second round, a few more scoring options open up. And all of a sudden, you're going to score in 8 different categories as opposed to just 4. And then finally, at the end of the third round, you're going to add 4 more scoring categories. So there's going to be 12 different scoring categories in total. Now, the cool thing about this game is that the worker placement works very interestingly, because the players start each round with 18 workers in their supply. You heard right, 18 workers. Because when you go to an unoccupied area in order to trigger its action, you're going to place 1 worker and therefore trigger its action. Very typical to worker placement. However, that action is not necessarily blocked from another player. Another player, or you yourself, the same player, can go to that same action as long as you place 1 more worker than what's already there. So you would have to place 2 workers in order to trigger it the next time, and so on and so forth. So sometimes you find yourself in some interesting situations where you really want to action, but you have to ask yourself, is it worth placing 4 or 5 of my workers on that location for that action, or am I better off dividing these 4 or 5 workers among multiple actions? Something to consider. And then ultimately, you're trying to mine your mines for different coals, different types of coals, and fulfill these different contracts for victory points. So that's an additional way of scoring victory points on top of the other 12 ways of scoring victory points at the end of the rounds. Again, as I mentioned, it's not a very neat looking game. However, each player does have this little player board with a nice little elevator piece that you can use in order to move up and down your mines to collect the different pieces of coal. I find that to be a neat spatial element to the game. I like this game. It's a very enjoyable game. These 3 rounds pass really quickly. Contract fulfillment, worker placement, mechanisms I can get behind. My number 1 Michael Kiesling game, Coal Baron. And that's it for today's list, folks. Thank you so much for joining us here at Harry Met Board Games. Please comment down below and tell me what's your favorite Michael Kiesling game. I'm interested in reading what you have to say. This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.